So I'm really interested in talking about death today in relation to
You say depth or death?
death with some
That's
depth,
deep.
hopefully. Yeah.
You could have given us a little heads up.
Yeah, I know.
No.
It's like the shock effect. Right?
No, I mean-
AI and death. What are you going to do with it?
Well, Jermaine and I spoke briefly about this. If you'd like to start us off with who you are and what you're doing, etc. Very 2 sentences.
Okay, sure. So I'm Jermaine Ross Allen, and I'm a PhD student at Union Theological Seminary, studying social ethics and political theology.
And if we can speak up, and when we talk, just maybe try to project to the camera.
We're not mic'd, yes.
Yeah, we're not mic'd. So.
Okay.
Mhm.
I'm Chad Deschant. I'm a PhD student in computer science, and I'm studying artificial intelligence and teaching a class on the ethical, policy, and safety issues around artificial intelligence
And this is at Columbia University.
at Columbia.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Michael Haller, and I'm a Catholic priest and a former Carthusian monk. I'm also a sensei in the Zen tradition. And our church is right here by Columbia and by Union.
I'm Sergei Postansky, Orthodox priest and Union grad.
Matthew Alley. I teach philosophy at CUNY and ethics and environmental studies as well, and spend my time thinking about the relationship between ecology and other philosophical traditions.
And I'm Hassan Azad. I have a PhD in Islamic Studies from Columbia, and I'm currently pursuing an MDiv at Union, and also hope to be ordained as a priest in the Orthodox Church. So Jermaine, we spoke recently about the question of death in relation to artificial intelligence, and we spoke. It was very interesting back and forth, and one sort of many things that came up is the question of how death, at least in my mind, is through technology we seek to overcome death. Would you like to comment a little bit about that?
I don't have a lot of organized thoughts around it, but I've noticed that digital technology has given some people, maybe the notion is a good way to put it, but the notion that at some point we'll have the technological means by which we can transcend death. I've heard people make comments to the effect of uploading one's consciousness into a hard drive or some sort of thing, so that even though the physical body dies, there will be some essence of the person that survives physical death. And by that means, we could escape death. And so that raises interesting questions for me. For example, what is consciousness? What does it mean that no one has a definition of consciousness that most people recognize as the end of the conversation, or even perhaps the beginning of a conversation? But beyond all that, it still makes me think about what happens to life as we live it in an everyday sense, when some individuals have at their disposal enormous amounts of capital and technology to pursue a form of life that's out of reach for the average person. What happens to the everyday pedestrian sense of life in the flesh, if you will, when other forms of thinking about life can take precedence over others by virtue of capital, that sort of thing.
And something I really appreciated something. Many things you said. One particular thing that sticks out for me right now is you said that today we're living someone's notion of utopia,
Right.
and that's very that was fascinating. Would you like to say a little bit more about that?
So I've been thinking about utopia recently through the work of Ernst Bloch, and I've sort of regained some appreciation of the concept of utopia now that I can imagine how it serves our lives in a practical sense, how utopia can orient us toward a greater good than what is the case at the moment. At the same time, I realized that perhaps at the beginning of the Enlightenment period, there were individuals who imagined freedom to be a situation in which they did not have to deal with any external impediments to their will. I can do whatever I want, nobody can stop me. And of course, the best of Enlightenment thinking also took into consideration the public good. But at the same time, I think that there is a sense of utopia that has to do with not being limited to all of the problems that we have accumulated here on Earth, that somehow we can escape or just leave Earth and begin a different form of life elsewhere. And I think that turbo-capitalism has definitely helped accumulate mass amounts of capital in the hands of a few people who, in collaboration perhaps with the state or a group of states, can pursue those dreams in outer space without necessarily being held responsible to a democratic process or even a moral or ethical community that might suggest that we advance morally or ethically somehow, even as we expand technologically in other ways.
You mentioned also a 19th century philosopher you were reading and how he was commenting on about people of other races, non-whites, and that it was the job, the duty of Europeans to sort of keep control, as it were, so that these uncivilized peoples don't unsettle things and sort of just disrupt civilization as they knew it, as we know it. And we're talking also about how today the sort of dominant ideas and ideologies aren't that far removed from this 19th century philosopher and his sort of thoughts. And how do you think that ties in with continuing your point about seeking to certain stratas of society, Western society, seeking to explore space and go to Mars, and how do you see that as a continuation of some of these the thoughts of the 19th century philosopher you're talking about?
So we were talking about Hastings Rashdall. He was a theologian and biblical scholar who worked in England at the late 19th century, early 20th century. And I've just recently gotten into his work, and so I don't know his work thoroughly at all, but I'm reading him in Gary Dorian's book on Kant and Hegel. And immediately I was captured by what he began to say, because he was speaking about the value of human personality and how that represents some of what is indispensable within the Christian religious context. And I appreciated what he was saying as he was comparing his thoughts to Hegel and Kant and other thinkers. But as he began to expand more about the ethical implications of British civilization and European civilization as a whole, he made some comments that I really, really appreciated for their clarity and for their honesty. And he said that European socialism was a very dangerous idea. And he suggested that if socialism became the rule rather than the exception in Europe, then we would see a threat to European civilization. That the inclusion of inferior races like the Negro race, the Chinese race, he said, to be specific, that the inclusion of folks like us, like the Chinese, would actually be a threat to the progress of European civilization, and that the notion of fairness and inclusivity and access to opportunity should be taken seriously, but not so seriously that it actually causes a decline of European culture. And he said that socialists who thought anything to the contrary, were either dishonest, I believe, or not paying attention. And so that has me thinking, of course, from an ethical perspective, what does it mean to have a certain amount of success in civilization, if we can use that broad of a term, but technological success in the humanities, success in organizing at least a quasi-functioning state. These are the things that he said before World War I, of course. So what does it mean to be very, very successful in a handful of human endeavors and thereby make a distinction between who can contribute directly to that and who must merely fall in line and receive some of the residual benefits of that? As certain parts of that technological culture from the late 19th century have moved through the 20th century and into this position that we now occupy, I wonder if that kind of liberal racism has gone so far underground that we no longer think about how to interrogate our assumptions to actually locate that so that we can arrest its impact on people who are not necessarily in a decision-making process about how various technologies are administered, whether it's medical technologies, computer science, surveillance technologies, and any number of things. So those are some beginning thoughts that I have about that literature, and I still need to catch up on it.
So, thank you. Matthew, how do we start to question our assumptions? There's a general sense, typically when we talk about technology, not necessarily amongst us, but in mainstream conversations, that technology itself is neutral. Whereas, of course, everything we create has some sort of ideology built into it, whether consciously or unconsciously. Would you like to comment a little bit about that vis-a-vis artificial intelligence and technology in general, and then how do we start to question our assumptions? Or do you accept what I just said?
I think I can comment. I mean, you brought up two things that I kept thinking about as I was listening to everything else you said. We started out with this question of transcending life, right? And you notice that in all the stories we're given about these possibilities, they all are in one way or another disembodied versions of. They're not transcending death to continue living. They're transcending death to continue thinking, for instance, to continue having that. Some awareness that's disembodied, or if it's embodied at all, it's embodied, for instance, in computer software. And by the way, I think it's obvious that we're so far from actually being able to do that, but it's definitely populated the social imaginary of our time. So on the one hand, you've got an idea of transcending death that doesn't retain life. And then you have this other thing you bring up about the two planet folks, the people who are trying to go out, get outside of Earth's gravity, and they're transcending Earth. And it's difficult, and while this is a very sort of broad, it's as troubling a term as civilization, but for a different reason. It's transcending our quality as Earthlings. If you leave the planet, and you're trying to sort of eke out a life way, as an Earthling in space, and I think I might have said last time, I got a big thing for Captain Kirk, but I got Grizzly Adams in the background too. It's very complicated. But these two things to come together in ways that are really worth thinking about, because you transcend death by not continuing to live. You transcend Earth by not staying here. Neither one of these is, to my mind, a fruitful vision of transcendence, whatever it might be. Whatever is going to be interesting about how we can, because transcendence isn't just overcoming or surpassing its growth. And I think always ecologically, evolutionarily, even geologically, we're in this moment when we're trying to, when we have accidentally created a moment of sort of global geohistoric transcendence that we now have to sort of live within. So, coming back to your question as far as how we, in effect, you were asking, so how do we keep making sense of ourselves in a world that has this strange little ideological mess going on that you were describing some strands of, and making sense of ourselves in a way that we can actually go forward toward a future worth wanting, on a planet that can actually continue to flourish in some sense, no matter how much we have already, sort of etched in some change. And not to answer your question, but I think that's the kind of context within which we have to think about, imagining and reimagining ourselves. Technology, AI, I don't want to go straight to that specifically, but I think for me, I'm always interested in the sort of recontextualization that we're both finding and making along the way. And we're in a particularly, I've been thinking a lot about, we're sort of in this weird time that's a dusking and a dawning. There are these organisms that are they're crepuscular. They make their lifeways at dawn or at dusk. Some of them do it at both times. And they've come up with all these clever adaptations to handle that dim light. And, if it's too dark or too bright, they're out of here. They don't want anything to do. And we're in this sort of, crepuscular moment. And I think that's why utopian thinking is especially good for now. Utopia just means no place, right? But it's in the it's like it's something you find what you put there, in your imagination, but it can become, Bloch is really good about this, it can become a sort of a loose, open texture orientation for how we start, answering anew the kind of question you just asked about. Essentially, how do we make sense of ourselves in this particular
And a question that I'm personally very interested in is who's, and so building on some of the things that Jermaine said also, is who is the we that we conceive of when we say we. We have an assumption about who that we is in, say, in this particular context. At the same time, the we is very often already decided, always already, right? And that we, I'm reminded of the brilliant philosopher, anthropologist Talal Asad's sort of examination, the genealogical examination of the notion of humanity. And he very convincingly argues that this notion of humanity was, as we understand it today, was invented after the Second World War, and it became a synonym for Christianity. And it had, Assad argues, it had built into the notion an other. It had difference built into it. So to continue some of the things that Jermaine was pointing to is, and I'm very sort of conscious of this given my background as a Muslim historically, is how the we doesn't necessarily include everyone. I mean, a very common thing that we hear, which is very true, is the people who have the least, contributed the least as far as ecological degradation globally, they're suffering the most. My parents originally come from Bangladesh. Bangladeshis are probably going to go under quicker than everyone else, and they have the least contribution in those terms. So the we, we have we. So the problem with language. About your point regarding, how far into the future is the notion of uploading our consciousness. I was just listening to on the way here Yuval Harari's book, Homo Deus, and he sort of talks about, he mentions how Peter Thiel, for instance, has said publicly that he wants to live forever. He's worth $200 billion by estimating, that's how much they estimate. Google is dedicating 38% of its, set aside $2 billion for directly in biological research, and there's some very serious, very serious people saying that they want to do away with death. Death is a technical problem. Aubrey de Grey, who was at, I believe, Oxford or Cambridge for a long time, he's a gerontologist now in Silicon Valley with his own company, and he's getting a lot of money, and he says that death is the major human ill that we have to do away with. What are your views?
I'm not sure why you picked on me. So I think
you don't want to transcend death?
Well, I do think the connection between this and computer science is fairly tenuous. Just to put that out there at the beginning. That's sure. I'm not going to be here speaking about computer science's view of Aubrey de Grey.
Sure, yeah.
But I think that in practice, what would probably come of Peter Thiel's millions and Google's billions will be perhaps practical steps forward toward improving health. I imagine they're not going to be able to transcend death anytime soon, and so what they will do is, I don't know about Aubrey de Grey, but probably Google Calico division, I think they call it.
Yes.
I imagine they're going to take practical steps to perhaps extending the livable life of people and the happy, healthy years of people. And there will be some of these issues of inequality and who gets to have access to these advanced medical treatments that are typical for all medical treatments. Right. But I imagine that at first, even though they set this goal, that there will just be steps along the way, and hopefully some of them will be beneficial. And so I'm not sure that there will be any big issues to wrestle with as far as the end of death, regarding that, because unless they just squander it all, saying, well, we're either going to end death or we're not going to do anything. Hopefully something useful will come out of it.
And to your point, if I may quickly add to your point, regarding what is the connection between computer science and death or immortality.
Right.
I mean, my sort of working assumption here is that as human beings, for better or for worse, we have a tendency to want to consciously or unconsciously imbue our notions of humanity, whatever they may be, in our technologies. And I can't help but think that computer science being the sort of at the sort of forefront of technological innovation today, that it somehow is a receptacle for some of these assumptions about how do I imbue, whether my music, if I'm creating digital music, or art, or computer programs, if I'm a computer programmer and otherwise, with my own sense of posterity. How can I live forever, whether literally or not? So that's kind of my working assumption here.
Well, I'm jumping out of my skin here because religion has its own answers to some of these things.
Right.
We don't transcend death.
Right.
Death is transcendence.
Right.
That's how we transcend.
Right.
That's the next step. We can talk about the movie Lucy, where she becomes electromagnetism in the whole
love
cosmos.
that movie, yeah.
Well, we become electromagnetism in the whole cosmos anyway. When we that's the point of the risen Christ, as we see it, the point of the expansion that can be ours through death. Right. These other transcendent things that we're talking about are just a delaying of the. It's as you were saying, it's staying on the same dimension. Especially if you're talking about going to another planet.
There's no body.
Well, especially, whereas the interesting thing is that in religion says we do, the bodily aspect is continued and is integrated, but in a higher wavelength, in a higher vibration, So first of all, we have to understand what we mean by transcendence, I hope we never transcend death, because death is the transcendence that we have to go through to another level. We are going to live forever, but not by, cryogenesis, or not by putting ourselves, into electromagnetism, uploading our consciousness to anything, as we see in several movies that are out there. So when you talk about utopia, I'd say, well, first of all, call it the kingdom of God, call it the kingdom of heaven, and as it's been interpreted theologically, that has a dimension on our own planet, yes, where we try and make a space where all cultures, all religions, all times, can have, a full piece of the pie, or contribute to the whole. But then also the kingdom of heaven in the ultimate transcendent meaning, which is going to be, only when we transcend this dimension, and then the dimensions, feed into each other as well, influence each other. But there's the other element that Jermaine was talking about, about the cultural thing. It is. I'm not familiar with that philosopher's work in the 19th century, but that kind of Eurocentrism equals Christianity is cringeworthy, to us today, and rightly so. Especially if you did it before the First World War. You look at the 20th century in Europe and say, this is civilization? 2 world wars, not to mention all the communism and all the stuff that came through.
That rhetoric continues, though, does it not?
What?
That rhetoric continues.
Of course it continues. It's even worse today here in America and in Hungary, So of course it does, and that's why it's so insidious. But here again, religion of whatever stripe, the best of Christianity, the best of Buddhism, reminds us that all of us are all one, that we are one another's consciousness, that we are all one another's being, that we're all interrelated, whether it's called the body of Christ or Buddha nature, or whatever it is. So it's a democratically, arranged kind of ultimate vision of things, where everyone is magnificent, everyone, and then how that is expressed in the various cultures are very, very precious. I'm so privileged here to be in a French-speaking church where we have a huge West African community, and to see their energy, their beauty, their choir. I mean, it's just magnificent. And this has been so underappreciated throughout history, and needs to be. And China, I hope it becomes ascendant. It's 3,000 more thousand years that it's been there, with an incredible civilization, an amount of energy and philosophy and religion, which we so need. We can so enrich each other on these levels, but we have to appreciate each other that way. And by the way, Christianity is not European; it's Middle Eastern. So all these things, that have been historically and culturally, twisted out of shape. Right. We have to, and I hope in our global time, as religions are talking to each other, and nations hopefully are talking to each other, races are talking to each other, that we can begin to have this really, really deep appreciation for mining the incredible wealth and welcoming the beauty of all human beings, and seeing that that's us, it's a gift to us, and we have to give to them and one another. This is the way I think it should be moving, and that's already transcending quite a bit. That's already, branching out.
And I can't help but feel, reflecting on the symbolism of the cross.
Yes.
That we have we've talked about this before, the sort of horizontal axis and the vertical axis, and the horizontal is always pierced by the vertical.
Right.
And to my mind, a simple reading of technologists seeking of transcendence through technology itself is a complete removal of the vertical dimension, and that how can we transcend within this horizontal plane, which is always, from a kind of religious cosmological point of view, as far as I can tell, is always doomed to fail.
Well, doomed not to be enough.
It's doomed not to be enough.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and it does have a vertical dimension. It's rooted in elitism and asymmetrical power structures.
I think
the vertical. No, I know. I'm making a snarky comment.
But the horizontal, right? No, the purely horizontal.
It's perfectly horizontal.
Right.
It's not at all flat. If you
Right, and it doesn't surprise me that we again, whatever that we means, but we have
something to talk about.
we seek to certain sectors of society want to therefore transcend this earthly plane, the literal physical earthly plane, and go to other planets, and because there is a type of transcendence, but it's within this horizontal. And Father Michael, you mentioned, you reminded us that Christianity is not a Western religion, historically wasn't, but is an Eastern religion. Father Sergei, would you like to comment a little bit on the historic sort of disjuncture that happened and continues between Western, I'm not pointing to Father Michael, but between Western Christianity and Eastern Christianity? What were some of the central points of disagreement? And historically, what are the commonalities? How can we? Because to my mind, I'm biased obviously because I'm Eastern Orthodox, but I don't think I'm too biased because I came to it very recently. Just based on my studies so far, I can't help but feel, with due respect to you as a resident Catholic priest. By the way, Father Michael is also my spiritual advisor as well, as is Father Sergei. So I'm really branching out.
Don't apologize.
No, I can't help but feel that Eastern Christianity is meant to play a massive role in terms of the West's intellectual, spiritual renewal.
Pope John Paul himself said that in a big document he wrote 20 years ago.
Oh, interesting. The two lungs.
Oh,
wow. And so I'm proud to have come to that conclusion myself apparently. Maybe not, because he said it before. Anyway.
Well, if you look at things historically, it becomes kind of a bit more complicated, because if you think about this Western Christianity, that its original seat and its original kind of ground was in Carthage, which is North Africa, obviously, most likely black, in any case pre-Arab invasion, Maghreb kind of, which was kind of more, I guess, color-wise like Sub-Saharan. So, and that's where it all started. We have the main sort of characters residing there, like Tertullian, like Cyprian, like many others, perhaps, Augustine, of course. So, I mean, this is a major historical metropolis. Whereas in the East, it's again Alexandria. It's kind of Africa. So, but by the time all these dudes, like in the 18th century, started this, early 16th century, but when it came to this point of ideological justification of this whole imperial expansion, they found Africa and Asia not in a great shape, so to say, right? And that's where the whole discourse came from. Like, these guys are, an obstacle. They're not well developed. Because at that point Europe was indeed, it took kind of charge, it took leadership, and it's now it keeps holding it, right? But since it's in a kind of self-destructive mode of being, most likely it will exterminate itself quite soon, you know, like if you killing machines, just like, you know, like crushing and just, you know, I'm not as optimistic about thinking, you know, of all these technological advances, Google and things like that. There'll be no Google maybe like in 20 years, it'll be just rubble, you know, and then, you know, you might have like...
Use rubble, sorry.
Yeah. And, you know, you might have another race or civilization. So it's all historically determined, roughly speaking, right? So Africa at a certain point was the cradle of civilization and Christianity, right? Then it lost it. Europe took over. And so now I think it's all moving here, perhaps North America, South America. I mean, it's all strange. I mean, like, it's all... So I wouldn't pay that much attention to, like, you know, any of this, you know, discourses, because they're very historically kind of determined and they have to be properly contextualized, right?
Right.
So Europe, you know, at the time of Christianity, it's nothing. It's in a tribal state of existence, right? There's nothing going on there, like, kind of, you know, like,
Right.
no written languages yet, so it's kind of, it came to power later, you know, High Middle Ages, things like that. So in this case, I should say that though, yes, both branches of Christianity were kind of very much rooted in that sort of Africa / Middle East, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, etc. Now, yes, it kind of branched out, and we have two very distinctive sort of Christian theologies, so to say. But then again, I mean, cannot be sort of, we can't push it to like a hostile kind of generalization, because, you know, I mean, if you speak again about West and East, like the Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches are kind of, you know, like very close to one another, but then the Protestant churches are, you know, kind of, so it's, there's no such thing as like East and West theologically. It's just kind of too many complexities, too many subtleties, I guess. Just within the West, you know, you have such a range, such a spectrum of choices. Like.
To my mind, and this is a huge generalization, but to my mind, in my experience and studies, the significant difference between the Western Church and the Eastern Church, and somehow technology comes into this whole mix, you know, it's a paradoxical manner for me. The major difference is in the sort of, for want of a better term, it's a problematic term, but the mysticism of the Eastern Church. It's a deeply spiritual church and worldview, which Western Christianity, for the most part, has lacked, and therefore it doesn't surprise me that in the West there's such a deep yearning for these more spiritual traditions, and, you know, the sort of, you know, whether Hinduism or...
As you say, that is, of course, a big generalization.
It's a big generalization, right.
But basically it's true. You're talking about the Eastern, and generally the East, not just Eastern Christian, but generally the East as compared to the West philosophically. You know, it's the unity of all things versus the distinction of all things. And that takes a religious form of mysticism, and in the Roman Church especially, philosophy and law, legalism. I mean, that's what Rome is famous for, Latin and the whole thing. So and that brought to science and technology came out of that as well. So the West has that to offer, but the East in general, like Christianity and beyond, does have a mystical element to offer. And it's very, very, you know, oversimplified. But that basic dichotomy or mutual enrichment is what's at stake.
And it's a dichotomy that I'm painfully aware that's been problematized by academics, saying, you know, this is a simplistic.
But there's a grain of truth.
And power-oriented sort of designation by Westerners vis-a-vis the East as well, and there's a whole history about that. Yeah. It's like a type of Orientalism. Nevertheless, I think for me it's somewhat beneficial to think through. As far as technology is concerned, I think we may have discussed before. Some authors are. There's a book that's at least 10, 15 years old at this point, I believe, called Techgnosis, where the author argues that through technology there's a new type of mystical experience that we're inculcating within ourselves, and I'm not doing the work justice, but
Ready Player One? No?
Ready Player One, right? You're really up to it on your movie.
I've seen it already.
You've seen it already?
Yeah.
Me too. So
That's probably what you're
what is
talking
that?
about.
I have no idea what the reference
The
is.
most recent Steven Spielberg film that opened last week,
Called,
Ready Player One. It's basically about people living in a desolate Earth in 2045 in Cleveland, Ohio. Who there's a global game that they play called the Oasis, and that's where they live, and that's where they do their spiritual search, and that's where they meet one another.
Right.
That's the kind of thing you're talking about, basically.
Right. What are some of your thoughts on this, Jermaine, as far as seeking spirituality through technology, but especially digital technology, because it's so omnipresent, and it's set to be even more all-encompassing in years ahead.
I can't say I have any specific thoughts about spirituality through technology. And as a Protestant, and as an American, and as a Black American Protestant, spirituality is a complicated concept. And I remember when I first decided to live a somewhat Christian life, people exposed me to a lot of different spiritual traditions that came from the Catholic Church, some from Eastern Orthodox traditions, and some of those things were helpful and some of those things weren't. And I've continued to think about what is spirituality. And when I think of digital technology, I think particularly of opportunities and infrastructures through which the possibility of connection is expanded. Mm-hmm. And I say possibility because the very opposite can take place. Yeah. That you can become completely idiosyncratic, closed in upon yourself in this weird solipsistic reality where you're glued to an interface and you mistake an interface for an actual human encounter. And so when I do think of computer technology and digitality, I don't necessarily automatically think about something that is a spiritual benefit, but I think potentially it could be if spirituality is at its root our capacity, or at least the potential that we have to make use of the connections with God that are in the world, that are within us, and that exist as possibilities, between persons. But at the same time, of course, I think it's ambiguous because, all connections are ambiguous. We can use digital technology to have more efficient ways to kill each other. Warfare is more efficient with digital technology, just as much as texting someone to say, "Hey, I haven't seen you in a while. How are you doing?" Is also facilitated by technology. So I think at the same time, if you can say it this way, sort of our organic technology of spirituality continues to be our imaginations and our ability to think about what our options are. How can I connect with God? How can I connect with myself? How can I connect with other people? Sometimes that means withdrawing from technology.
Is technology hijacking our imagination in some ways? Digital technology, especially. I've been doing some reading on, particularly on pornography and how it's really damaging so many men in particular, but not just men, in terms of how they, it's really affecting them on a fundamental basis.
I think at this point we have to engage our own agency, and not just the individual person's agency, but human beings are making opportunities for technology to do certain things. And so I think that we can misuse technology and we can help fund misuses of technology, but I still don't think that I would blame technology. I wouldn't really take the Luddite turn too quickly, because I think that we have to learn about what it means to be responsible for a wide range of possibilities that may have exceeded our spirituality and our maturity at this point. And so the fact that I can ignore, real connection and beneficial erotic relationships with another person because, who knows, out of laziness or whatever, I've got this digital object that I can interact with.
It's not just laziness, and research is showing that people increasingly don't like the real erotic encounter, that the digital is much more satisfying on a level which the real can't satisfy.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so I think, for me at least, the question has to do with discipline. And I think it's discipline that definitely has a spiritual correlation. Because certainly if you engage sexually with something that can't respond to you and something that doesn't give you any resistance or, no human personality that requires you to actually grow and develop and come outside of yourself, you certainly will probably grow accustomed to a certain facility or a certain ease with a machine, or with digital images. But I think that has to do with the results of constant habituation and interaction with that which is not human, which gives some free rein, to your ego in a way that isn't helpful. But I think, again, that's a misuse of technology. And so, of course, technologies can be developed to abuse that capacity or that potential.
Right. No, and this is a question that I mentioned already and that I think about a lot. Is you mentioned the issues of agency, issues of correct use and misuse and so forth, and I can't help but remember that these technologies are not. There's a certain sort of intentionality built into the technologies. I mean, there's all these revelations coming out now about Facebook, for instance. I mean, these are very well-designed systems that are meant to mine us for. I mean, we're living in an attention economy, what they call now, right? That this is how we're sort of monetized today, and these platforms are designed specifically with that in mind. How much can we capture people's attention, and they sort of give bursts, sort of chemical pleasure bursts and so forth. As far as the intentionality of technology, digital technology especially, what can we do? What can we do? If we have companies like Facebook, which are increasingly amassing so much power and wealth, companies like Google and so forth, to what extent does the average Joe, I don't know why he got called Joe, but does anyone know? Anyway, the average Muhammad, sort of, what chance does he or she have? I struggle, and I have a pretty, I'm pretty well educated, factually speaking. I'm very well educated. I have a PhD from Columbia, and I struggle on a daily basis. What does someone without the benefits of a PhD from Columbia do?
Well, I don't know. I think it's only going to get worse because I think that technology is pretty crude now at the moment. The technology for tapping into people's emotions and monitoring them and really being orchestrated in a way to constantly stimulate them. I think it like Facebook and Twitter and a few of these companies are doing a tiny bit of research on how to get people to stay engaged. But it's only scratched the top of the bit of the surface. So I think it's only going to get worse. I think also... Sorry?
It's going to get worse because
they're going to become much more manipulative. And the technology is going to become much better and much more appealing. So as we have virtual reality or augmented reality, it's going to blur the distinction. So now you could say, okay, this is real and this is not real. But pretty soon we'll be living in this augmented reality world where that's going to be much harder to draw. We're going to have robots that will be much more interactive, much more human-like. Earlier I wanted to kind of push back on some of your skepticism about extending life and about going to Mars, because I think in these cases sometimes technology could be doing good things. But in this case, when we were talking about pornography, I think the thing that has to be mentioned is that people are already working on robots designed for sex.
Right.
And there are books about this, there are conferences, there are companies working on it.
Right.
And given that a vast amount of the internet traffic is already devoted to pornography, I'm sure we can look forward to is the wrong phrase, but I'm sure that there will be vast numbers of robots designed for sexual interactions, and that this kind of dehumanization and changing what it means to have this kind of a relationship is just going to get much worse because people don't respond really all that intimately with an iPhone or a computer. I mean, it is just a lump of, it's just a screen, and it's just a keyboard. But if you have a machine that looks like a person, and you know, already people are very empathic about these robotic dogs that look like vaguely like dogs, and they look kind of cute, and people really get attached to them, and they have genuine emotional feelings for them. And so if we have robots that look more like people, and we will in the next 10 years, that can interact with us, they will manipulate, they'll be able to manipulate our feelings for them dramatically. And so there are people working on this, and there are some computer science ethicists, Joanna Bryson, who came to speak in my class, who thinks that precisely because of this, we have an obligation not to create robots that look like people, because we will just fall for the trap of relating to them in a way that isn't real, and we'll mistakenly ascribe to them agency that they don't deserve. You know, and that's great that she thinks that, but that's, you know, it's still going to happen. They're still going to build these machines.
It's still going to happen because
people want them, and because companies think that they can sell them, and because for some people, you know, there may be some use cases, even for the sex robots. There may be some people who can't, you know, experience emotional intimacy any other way for whatever reason, and this fills some sort of gap. And this is, you know, maybe for somebody, for a very small segment of the population, maybe it's useful. And so for them, we'll say, okay, well, we'll create it for them. Or for caregivers, right? If we don't, as a society, we don't do a very good job of caring for the elderly, and people who are in homes where they're cared for sometimes don't get the kind of care that they need. And if we had, you know, robots that could operate in the physical world and be attentive to people and take care of them, this would fill a gap that as a society we're not filling. And we could say, well, that's very dehumanizing, and instead we should be providing them with human caregivers. But we're not, right? As a society, we're deciding that we're not. And in Japan and soon China and other countries that are aging very fast and are going to have a very mishmashed population pyramid where they're going to have far too many people who are elderly to be taken care of intimately by people, they're going to have a need for this kind of robotic caregivers. And I'm sure that the way that they get related to, you know, we'll think of it as somehow twisted, because they'll be, you know, attached to the robotic caregivers in a way that they probably shouldn't be, because they're just, you know, at least at first, they're just a bunch of code and they don't really have any opinions on things.
I mean, a very simple solution to this problem is it's not as if there aren't enough poor people in the world. There are many poor people in Bangladesh, for example. They'd be very happy to move to Japan, I promise you, to work as caregivers. So, you know, so there's a whole issue. I mean, it sounds like a flippant comment, but it's actually, I mean, I'm trying to point to the problem of, you know, nation states and these aging populations, you know, these sort of developed nations that are aging super fast, and they don't have enough people to take care of them and themselves. And it's an issue of distribution. It's an issue, I think, which you pointed to. And you mentioned earlier as well. The underlying problem is that of capitalism or turbo-capitalism, and it's profit over people. I mean, this is the dominant philosophy.
I can't help but thinking of a couple of entertainments again. You know, the movie Her with Joaquin Phoenix, where he forms an intimate bond with Siri.
Right.
You know, and then he finally discovers at the end that she's also talking to 3,000 other people. It's not as intimate as he thought. And believe it or not, none of you're old enough to remember this, but back in the Twilight Zone, back in the late 50s and early 60s, the TV show, there was actually one guy was sentenced to living on an asteroid by himself for the rest of his life.
Oh, wow.
So they brought him a robot, a woman robot, and he resisted it. He said, "This is not real," until she won him over. And by the time he was freed, and they didn't have room on the spaceship to take her back too, he was so attached and so horrified. So this is like 60 years ago that they're already thinking about this stuff.
And this is a topic that Ex Machina explores.
That's right. But spiritually speaking, again, it does come back to what Jermaine was saying about discipline. I mean, there has to be a spiritual. Who am I really?
Right.
What are ethical and spiritual values for me? What is community? Who am I really? To be able to say, well, I'm going to use these in a responsible way, and I know what's really life-giving and life enhancing and what's not.
Discipline is such an ugly word, though, today, right?
That's why it has to be.
I don't think it's an ugly word.
No, but it does have to be
but-
based on spiritual experience. I think to
Yeah.
really, in other words, really to speak to people and to grab people. It can't just be say, well, follow these rules because it's like going on a diet. Or
Well, that's people's immediate sort of gut reaction. It's like, oh, you're trying to limit me, and you're trying to put your Catholic rules
These
in
are
the
liberating.
Orthodox or what have you.
But if it's based on intimate spiritual experience, then it's
Well,
different.
I mean, I can't help but think of one of my sages, Michel Foucault, who towards the end of his life thought very seriously about what he called technologies of the self, and that these they're sort of essential to the formation of the self, and they happen whether we choose them consciously or not. We're always being shaped. Our sort of sense of self, our subjectivity is always being shaped.
And is self-shaping.
And is self-shaping. What do you mean by that?
Well, I was just thinking, do people make jokes about you saying germane things? They must. You said,
Rarely.
you said, okay, no, you said another thing. When you said earlier
It's spelled differently.
of course. Sorry, when you mentioned earlier that there's a lot of ambiguity, and I think this comes back. There's an opportunity because we don't like the word discipline, so there's an opportunity to come picking up on your idea, the technologies of the self. If you encounter real ambiguities in the real world, the appropriate response is ambivalence. Right? We're ambivalent about these technologies. You're saying because they're ambiguous. I mean, some good can come of it, perhaps even of a sex bot, right? Given what you said. But that ambivalence, I feel like one of the disciplines we can cultivate that has a certain spiritual quality, though I'm dipping into a vocabulary I don't use much anymore. But I like to think that we need to become, vigilantly ambivalent. There's got to be a certain vigilance
Vis-a-vis technology?
because the technology is moving so fast, and we've got these capacities and inclinations and sort of behavioral qualities that have evolved not just across ecological time but across evolutionary time. It is so easy. I mean, I remember we got one of those. What are they? The little vacuum cleaners.
Roomba.
Roomba. We had a dog that shed a lot, so the Roomba was sunk before it got started, right? But I remember when the little thing, they just use prosy, and it like starts out and goes da 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 da, and you think hi, and then it gets stuck in the dog hair and goes the poor little guy. If we can go so easily toward that sort of empathetic relationship with the goofy little, it was remarkable.
And these
to watch.
technologies are designed like that.
Of course, that's why there's prosody. It could have just been silent, but instead it sort of
Right,
said, oh, it's okay, I'll help. And so, if we get better and better at the presentation, if it walked in, so vigilant ambivalence, I think, is a part of a disciplined life today,
Right.
because there's so many ambiguities, and these technologies are interfacing, and just to give one more example, if you think, I teach a lot of my students where I teach are, first generation inner city college students who have no opportunities, to even go to the North Woods and Central Park, let alone go out into some place we might call a natural environment. And it's a wonderful gift that they can look on the screen and see so much of the remarkable footage that's been made of natural environments. Natural is a word can you just assume the scare quotes are there? Around the world. It's a wonderful gift, and it's a disaster at the same time. Because the opportunities, a civilization worthy of the name would presumably give all of its citizens it would be a civic opportunity to experience something of that directly in the flesh, in the ecologically evolved sense of our flesh and blood.
It's a disaster also because BBC makes these really phenomenal nature documentaries, and they recently came under, I can't remember when it was, not too long ago, they came under a lot of flack because all these incredible documentaries, they present the natural world in all its glory while diminishing the actual the awfulness that that human beings have been doing to it. And in some ways, I think I was reading an article about this. They're arguing that people become complacent vis-a-vis the natural world. And they think, oh, well, everything looks great. And
Strangely enough, people reach that conclusion even though all those shows emphasize primarily sex and aggression and conflict. When you watch the animals, it's the guys running, and the lions eating the lamb and so on, when in fact so much of evolutionary and ecological history is about cooperative and collaborative stuff. It's ugly and scary and bloody too, but it's not red and tooth and claws. Like that's just
Not the whole story.
Very simplistic, right?
At best half. And if you look at the, well, I'm on a roll here, but if you look at the earliest history of life on Earth, it's actually far more about collaboration and cooperation than it was about competition.
Well, you touched on something interesting. As you were talking about, inner city kids being able to see like natural beauty. Like it reminds me of this relationship between like opportunity and duty. And I think that there's something that we haven't quite gotten as as Westerners or as modern people, that the extent to which someone has a great deal of opportunity isn't arbitrarily related to those who don't have opportunity. And I think that there is something about, like we said, discipline, but also responsibility that we don't like in our culture. And we haven't necessarily developed, like the technologies of the self to really figure out what does it mean to have a sense of responsibility and discipline that's commensurate with these enormous capabilities that we're developing and that we've only seen the tip of. And I'm thinking about, the woman that you mentioned who thinks developing human-like robots to have sex with is probably a bad idea for the most part. Like I'm imagining what she would sound like talking to a group of engineers, CEOs, about what you shouldn't do.
Right.
And it's almost absurd to even think that we would expect human beings to be able to do something but decide not to do something just because it's a bad idea. And I think that speaks to something kind of scary. I think about where we are as a species, and that's a general or generous way of calling it because it's a few of us, I think, who have got the opportunity to make decisions that are bad for the majority, but we have the liberty to do them anyway. And so you design a culture where it's almost impossible to even discuss limiting oneself for the greater good. And at least for me, as an ethicist, that's something that I have to wrestle with. Is like with this concept of liberty we have that is so absurd, that my liberty to do whatever I want with money and technology because there's a market for it. Like that sounds more natural for people to hear me say that and say, yeah, of course. Even in the minds of people who would suffer as a result of those technologies being
Clearest example is the NRA right now.
Well,
what I'm saying,
sure.
you use whatever, all the freedom I can possibly have to do this because there's some basic right there, and I can do whatever I want no matter who gets hurt. That's basically what you're saying.
Closer to home to me, thinking about like this phone.
Yeah.
I've gotten this weird habit lately that, I realize that there are a lot of minerals that go into making this phone, and it makes my life, especially for, a person who's a student without a lot of money. Phones are expensive, but they actually save you a lot of money, and a lot of time, and a lot of labor. And I think about, the kids who have to like just, not play, but, just sort of, I don't know, iron pick their way through like dirt, and rocks and in caves for their entire life, with no access to education or opportunity because they're trying to find like cobalt to sell for these machines. And like caring about that is strange. Like it's almost an example of something that's not real to say it. But to express to people like maybe we should risk slowing down our technological development so we can figure out how to get these materials in a way that's somewhat more balanced and somewhat more equitable.
It's almost unthinkable, as you say. And on the question of discipline, spiritual discipline, we just came out of Easter in the Orthodox Church, and there's a lot of spiritual discipline, of course, in all the Christian traditions. Not least of all the Orthodox Church, that there's a lot of emphasis on fasting and standing in vigil for hours on end is exhausting. At the same time, the question of discipline and embodied tradition, this is something Foucault talked about, and I think one of the shortcomings of Western Christianity especially has been its moving, especially with Protestantism, moving away from the embodied tradition. And again, it's not surprising for me to think that yoga is such a big phenomenon in the West, because we need these embodied practices. Otherwise, we can't connect with that deeper self. So, as far as Orthodox Christianity is concerned, could you speak a little bit to the question of discipline, to the question of cultivating a spiritual core, so that we relate to one another as though that we recognize the deep interconnection that we have, and not just with one another as human beings, but with one another as far as the natural world is concerned, because again, as within the Islamic tradition, in Eastern Christianity especially, there's a deep emphasis on all of creation, while in the Islamic tradition it's all of creation hymns God's praise. In the Eastern Christian tradition, as far as I understand it, I'm still learning, is that it hymns Christ's name, which is in very ways very similar.
Yeah, well, I would say that if you think historically, there were kind of two ways to think about it, right? So ultimately speaking, both ways kind of aim at making sense of soteriology. How can you be saved, right? So, and what is it that is to be saved? I mean, one kind of more intellectual way was to think that it's this kind of noetic self that becomes, redeemed, saved, and that this whole salvific process is, redemptive process is accomplished through theory and contemplation, kind of, intelligible ascent to the source of being, kind of. So it's deeply intellectual, kind of noetic, at its core, and any accretions that pertain to body or lower faculties of the soul, they just gradually
They fall away.
to be set aside and fall away, and kind of, and you can see such things, such intellectualist soteriology in many ancient philosophies, like Plotinus, for instance. But then you have a slightly different approach that sort of incorporates our bodily existence also. And it's a lot less intellectualist at its core, at least as far as soteriology was concerned, right? And in this case, what comes to mind is liturgical or theological sort of tradition that would say that, there's this holistic unit such as a human being, and which consists of different elements, right? It's a very kind of complex thing. It has its own phase that goes beyond the intelligible. It has all kind of intellectual sort of aspects and things like that. But it has also its own pneuma, pneuma, or ochima, this sort of celestial vehicle, that sustains this whole kind of superstructure, right?
Right.
And that is very firmly rooted in this created cosmos,
Right.
and is kind of formative for its well-being, right? So to keep it pure, to keep it pure from stains and scratches, as a perfect mirror that can reflect God, it was considered to be a very, very significant task, and therefore this whole task of purification, self-control, discipline, right? Not just your noetic, not just your intellectual self-control and discipline that you aim at to sort of transform yourself into a pure self-thinking entity. Now, this is a bit more complex. That entails your bodily state of conditions, the way you eat, the way you breathe, what you do to other people and the earth.
How you think, what
and
you look at.
social, yeah,
It's a complex technology, again, a very, very well thought out technology of the self, which many of us, probably most of us in the West balk at.
Exactly. But the bottom line is that it has to be liturgically sort of experienced, right? It has to be done, taken into account this complexity or kind of holistic mode of subsistence of humanity, right? Which entails both intellect, body, and soul.
Which is no longer a cool idea that we have to, that somehow there's a superstructure, if we see it like that we have to submit to, and it's all about individualism today. And,
well, if it's all noetic, it's easier to download.
Exactly, that's what Kathy was talking about.
Could you say?
When I was talking, I mean, the idea of transcending death that we started with through digital technologies. Again, I can't speak to the actual technological possibilities and prospects for it, but what's in the imaginary presentation of it is this idea of taking consciousness, which is completely ill-defined, and downloading it into a disembodied or something made of silicon and various rare earths and other things. And by the way, those kids are at both ends of that thing, because when you throw it away, it'll likely end up somewhere where kids are going to dig through it. Look for that stuff. Anyway, but so we have this. It's easy to slip into the dualistic way of thinking about it, and there's the noetic dimension, that purely, we might call it cognitive, leaving aside all of the embodied, emotional, affective, physiological, wet, juicy, bloody stuff, and then there's the thing to preserve, the cognitive, the noetic. That you can do that, and then I'll be eternal. I mean, maybe we're going to have to make robots into which we can put the.
But that kind of dualism,
which is what people are talking. That's the dream and the nightmare. But so that's what I meant.
The dualism is behind it, and that's a really important one, which is still rampant today. Richard Rohr, who's a Franciscan priest, is a great mentor of mine and a friend, and of course the Franciscans represent earth and water and mountain and sun and moon.
And he's done extensive research on male initiation.
I did his male initiation retreat.
Richard Rohr.
Yes.
Father Hunger, is he the man who wrote about that concept?
Yes, so I've taken his men's initiation retreats, which are always done and always have been done in the middle of nature, to face the elements and your own self, your bodily self and emotional self. But his teacher of Christian history in the seminary, or in his novitiate, he always likes to tell this story. At the end of their 4 years together, going through Christian history, as he was going out the door the last day, he turned around and said, "Now remember, gentlemen, Christianity has been more influenced by Plato than by Jesus."
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And he was right. That's where you get all this noetic stuff and all, that this is, we're not just minds, But Platonism, had a huge influence on the Greek fathers of the church and on who knows else, maybe St. Paul, Augustine. So this has crept into our psychology and even on our philosophy too. Descartes was always, talk about separation of mind and body. At the beginning of modern philosophy. So people have this, built into them, especially some of our Christian training, that we get, about the evil of the body, the evil of sex. You've got to be. So it's built into this kind of dualism and idealism, where the spirit, whatever that means, is much better than the body. Misinterpretation of St. Paul when he says the spirit and the flesh are against each other. The flesh just means ego; it doesn't mean the body. So. It's horrible, and it's so pervasive. So it makes it all the easier for people today, without even realizing what's gone into their whole formation or the cultural formation of the ambience, to say, I just have to upload my consciousness. Whatever happens to my body, and I'm fine.
To be fair, though, I think
I'm going to be fair to something too.
Go on.
To be fair to the human organism, if you're not introduced to these kinds of dualistic ideas, they might not occur to you.
Indeed.
But humans have some good reasons to think, maybe that's the way it is, because I have dreams and my mind seems separate from my body. Right now here, I'll just think I just imagined myself out on the street and I stayed here. So we have lots of, it's like getting, feeling bad for your Roomba. There are reasons that we're vulnerable to these ideas. But it's become this sort of cultural, now civilizational, global vulnerability that's being instantiated in these technologies that promise ultimately to be able to show, yep, the two are separable, the body and the mind, if you will. Again, and I'm not speaking from a strictly computer science perspective. I can't speak to that, but this is what's going through people's imaginations today. This is what interests me, because the social imaginary that we've got, what I'd like to call the socio-ecological imaginary that we've got, is going to have a lot to do with where we go.
Right. And I wanted to be fair to Platonism as well, in that it's not simply dualistic, though. There's a sense, and the way you characterize Descartes, I think there's this huge distinction between, with due respect, between Descartes and Plato, right? Because in Platonism, there's a hierarchy of there's a distinction between nous and just plain ratiocination,
dialogues
right?
you're reading too. I mean, if you go.
But that's how it was at least interpreted through the Christian fathers and down through history. So, and what happened with Descartes? He made this, and thereafter is reason and intellect become equated. And this is the problem. This is one of the major problems. There's no longer a sense that, my reason isn't all that I am. I'm not just cognition. I'm not just consciousness in some sense.
You're not even cognition first.
I'm not even conscious. Cognition first, right?
Well, Sergei mentioned Plotinus. I mean, his notion of nous, the one beyond mind.
Right.
And all the medieval Christian philosophers spoke about a level of mind and intuition and oneness beyond reason. And so it is there, that higher sense. But too often it can be divorced, especially for ascetical reasons and all the fear and stuff that we have around the body and this shame and whatever there is. So that became a metaphysical proposition.
Well, it's interesting for me to think that while, again, in general discourse, mainstream, whatever, capitalist, consumerist discourse, we don't like the notion of, again, discipline and sort of doing without and asceticism and so forth. I'm fascinated to think that people like Tim Ferriss, for better or for worse, who's very influential these days, and others, Ryan Holiday and so forth, they're making Stoicism come back, and I think for the better, all of which is to to bring us back to the question of, I don't know if we didn't necessarily start with this question today, but we've spoken about it before, the question of the human being.
What is consciousness?
What is consciousness? What is the human being? I posed this question to you yesterday, and you had an interesting response.
Oh, I don't know if I can reproduce what I said yesterday.
That's okay.
Because I was just searching yesterday.
Yeah.
But I think, the human being is an interesting problem.
Right.
And I think that, on one hand, we can't escape duality. But I think perhaps what we can learn from the Apostle Paul is that we can take the hierarchy out of the duality.
Okay.
So that as human beings, of course, we're biochemical entities. Mm-hmm. And then there's this other thing that we can't pin down as precisely as we think we can pin down our biochemistry. And I think that we don't have to make a problem out of this other thing that we are besides our biochemistry, because our life is at least one iteration of a certain balance of all of these things. And so our bodies, of course, matter. Our intellect and our souls, like all of these things matter, and they collaborate to form this thing that we experience as our lives individually and our lives collectively.
It's already one in that sense.
It's actually in some ways, I'm sorry for interrupting, but I was just thinking that in some ways this bodily concern, I think with all technology, it kind of overrides everything, right? So the body is designed, as a very temporal, vehicle. It can live only for a certain much, not for a long time, and it becomes sort of a seat of all cancer cells at a certain point. It starts its decomposition quite at an early stage of its life, right? So roughly speaking, there's a certain much of burgers that you can eat, there's a certain much of pleasure that you can receive, etc., right? So life on Earth has an absolute value in some ways because, you do your virtuous conduct, you kind of attain like a certain state of whatever, immortality, or, you go to Hades and wait for the second coming of Christ, etc., etc. But it matters. It has to be, in one way or another, virtuous. It has to be reconciled with the will of God and things like that, right? But it's very finite, kind of, right? So this attempt to kind of, expand infinitely its kind of time span, right? That's, I think, one of the major forces behind all technological advancements, right? Like so you can consume more, have more burgers, more whatever pleasures, like kind of turn life into basically make pleasure your sole principle of self-determination, because otherwise the mission is accomplished. You reach your acme, you reach your high point where you kind of express yourself fully, in the way you were designed by God, and that's it. You have to go. And the thing is that, of course, from that more traditional perspective, afterlife was considered to be a better deal, kind of, because it's more ontologically stable, because it's a different mode of subsistence that is in some ways superior, kind of, than this one. But
but what do we do in a society where, Peter Thiel, I was reading earlier, he says that there are three responses to death: that we deny it, we deny it is one option, the other option is we accept it, and the third option is we fight it. And he says that I want to fight it, which kind of brings us back full circle to the question of death. But and we'll
Good place to end.
right, and we'll be wrapping up shortly. Can we? You've already answered this earlier, but I'm going to pose it again. There's a lot of discussion about seeking immortality through technology. Do you think we can actually do that? And if not, why? And if so, how?
Well, I guess coming at this from a perspective, a materialist perspective, where I think that basically what humans are is a collection of cells, and they're arranged in a certain fashion, and that our brain seems to be the most particularly important part of that, and the neurons are arranged in a certain fashion, and they're linked in a certain way, and this pattern could be reproduced. I think there's a sense in which there's something about that could be reproduced in a digital form, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the connections, the patterns could be recreated. Mm-hmm. Would that be us being immortal, or would it be some kind of like fake, like very poor copy that may respond to certain questions the same way that we would? Mm-hmm. So that I don't know. I don't know that anyone can answer that. I think life extension is a very different prospect. I think because we're products of evolution, and evolution is messy, and some things on this planet can live for hundreds of years longer than we can. And why is it that we have this lifespan that averages 80 or something? I think the chance that we could prolong that rather extensively is probably much greater than that we could ever achieve anything like immortality, or that we could download our consciousness. And I don't think that that's scary. I think, I would welcome that. I think people could find other things to do with their lives than stuff themselves with cheeseburgers and just live for pleasure. So I think that could be a good thing, and I think, as I mentioned earlier, it would probably lead to just searching for that is probably going to help us find a better understanding of the brain and human biology that could fight some of these cancers that we're otherwise racked with, and fight some of these other diseases that cause pain. So I think that the goal, even if the goal is perhaps unreachable, at least in the form that people imagine it's reachable, I think trying to get there is probably going to help a lot of people, and at least it has the potential to. And
someone's version of utopia.
It's someone's version of utopia,
right.
But that doesn't. To me, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily fictional. It means that we are just getting increasingly
Is it
powers.
necessarily good though?
Well, to me, I
It's
mean,
ambiguous.
I think it's ambiguous, right? And as society,
It's ambiguous and at the same time real. It's a reality that, whether that, I mean, today we're living someone's
Show me a
version
part
of
of reality
utopia.
that isn't ambiguous, and I'd like to meet it. I mean, ambiguity is part of the story here.
Right,
Right.
it's part of our story now. I don't think technology necessarily doesn't make our lives more ambiguous, right? I don't think that. I think our lives already
ambiguous.
right differently ambiguous. We have new things that we have to deal with, but I think the promise of it is that it will, be able to help many people, and whether or not we
That's
do
the promise, right?
is
Yeah.
is up to society and
That's
the
the
way that we treat
claim.
it.
That's the claim, right? Yeah, that we're going to help
Which
more
calls
people.
for the
But
question,
imagine-
how
imagine-
many and when
Yeah.
and where.
Yeah.
But from a spiritual point of view, I agree totally. That would be a great thing to experiment with and to move forward to enhance and prolong life for people in this dimension, in certain circumstances. But ultimately, and I've given spiritual talks on this, both as a Zen teacher and a Catholic. You don't fight death, ultimately. That's what I started by saying, too. That itself is transcendence. Don't rage against the dying of the light, all that stuff. That's spiritually very immature.
Right.
So all this can be true, but ultimately death is a mystery that brings us, we believe, into a further level of experience and consciousness and being. So, and the idea that we can have to rage and fight against death ultimately is, I think, very spiritually immature.
Well, that's a powerful note to end on. Thank you. I'd like to thank all of you today for joining us for this very rich, stimulating, thoughtful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for facilitating.
Thank you, Father Michael.
Everybody.
We're done for a while.
Thank you for your patience.
Thanks so much, Justin.
Thank you.
Very interesting.